Hello, everyone. Tony Costa here from Trial Apologetics. So glad that you could join us. I'd like to encourage you, if you've not done so already, to subscribe to the channel and also to like this video and to share this video. About a month ago, I joined Michael Jones and Erik Manning to discuss a scholar from the Westerner Institute, which is also the group that the Jesus Seminar was involved with, and she wrote a book calling into question the existence of the Apostle Paul. So we put that video out a month ago, and she got wind of it, and she responded to it or made some commentary about it. And Michael Jones had reached out to me on Facebook Messenger and had asked me if I wanted to respond to the video. It's not a very long video, it's just over 9 minutes. But I told Michael that I'd probably just take it on and review it. So here it goes. So I'm going to share the video, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the video, and then I will pause it when necessary, so that I can make some necessary comments. So let's listen in. This again is Paul, the Apostle Never Existed by Dr. Nina Livesey. And here it says that she's responding to inspiring philosophy, which is Michael's handle on YouTube, which I would highly encourage you to go and view. I may not agree with everything, every single point with Michael, but then again, who does? Which person agrees 100% with another? So there's some areas that I may disagree with Michael on, with Michael Jones, but he has a lot of great apologetic resources. So I would encourage you to check out his YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy. So let's, without further ado, let's look into this. And then what I'll do is I'll make any necessary comments and pause the video. I do want to thank Dr. Nina Livesey for responding to this, and also for highlighting it and calling more attention to it. So there's an old saying that there's no such thing as bad press. And so here we go.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another video on the History of podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Nina Livesey. She is the author of the book, The Letters of Paul in their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below and the pinned comment.
Just one thing I wanted to say here is in her book, Dr. Livesey has The Letters of Paul in the Roman Literary Context and Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. Um, I just find it ironic and odd that it would be called the Letters of Paul, because the reader looks at this and thinks, oh yeah, okay, the Letters of Paul, the Pauline epistles, etc., and the reassessing of the apostolic authorship. So again, people wonder, okay, does that mean Paul didn't literally write them with his pen, with his hand? Was it done through a disciple, a student of the Pauline school? But the title of the book doesn't give you the plain, straightforward thesis that Dr. Livesey is advocating for, and that is that the picture of the person there on the book, that person, according to Dr. Livesey, never existed. So I think the book title, I think it is a little, I'm not charging Dr. Livesey with deception or anything, but it is a little it's a little misleading, because it gives the impression that she believes Paul wrote those letters, which of course uh, she doesn't, as you will hear. And also for the response that myself and Erik Manning and Michael Jones gave, I will put a link in the description box of that as well. So let's continue listening.
In today's video, Nina's going to be responding to Mike Jones. He has a YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy. He recently conducted a live stream with two other individuals, Erik Manning and Tony Costa, who are also two other YouTube Christian apologists like Mike Jones is. and they did a response of the interview I did with Nina in the 2024 SBL. Nina's primarily going to be responding to the criticism of her views that they find very controversial or distasteful from their points of view. So, Nina, thank you for joining me today. And yeah, so go ahead and read your response.
Jacob, thank you for having me on and encouraging me to respond. Echoing what you've just said, I wanted to say that I did take the time to listen to the long podcast with speakers Mike Jones, Erik Manning, and Tony Costa. It was released on April 16th, and it was related to my recent work on apostolic authorship, as you've said. The video, however, was based largely on the interview I had with you, Jacob, on this channel, History Valley, and less, I think, on my book's arguments, directly on my book's arguments, I should say. Over the course of the video, the speakers, without evidence, assumed that I'm an atheist. In addition, they criticized not only my responses to you, Jacob, but also my manner of speaking, my hand movements, as well as your appearance.
Now, again, you get three YouTubers together, and of course, there's going to be a measure of humor. There's going to be a measure of what generally YouTubers do, and that is they may use humor, they may use satire, and so forth. That is not unusual in YouTube channels, and it's not unusual when we're discussing certain things. Now, in terms of Dr. Livesey being an atheist, I don't recall if I said that. I don't recall that I made the claim that she didn't believe in God. And certainly in her interview with this gentleman, I don't believe she ever raised the question of God's existence. So I'm not sure if I made that statement or Michael or Erik made that statement. I don't recall that. But again, to talk about her hand motions and so on, there seems to be, I guess, a little bit of ad hominem here. And when you have to resort to ad hominem and talk about, well, they're talking about my hand gestures and so forth. Look, in my videos, I've been accused of being an undercover Freemason because I use my hands too when I talk, and people have said that sometimes if I rest my hands and I do something like this, then oh, that's the Masonic pyramid. Dr. Costa is doing the Masonic pyramid, or whichever way I move my hands. I've been accused of being a Freemason. I've been accused of being an undercover Jesuit, and on and on and on it goes. Hopefully, it's not because I'm wearing a black shirt and a golden cross. But I'm not sure what relevance that has to the critique about the substance of her book or her arguments. It seems more like an ad hominem that, well, we're just out there to make fun of Dr. Livesey. That is not the case. Do we use humor? Yes. I think humor is a great way to break the ice. I think it has its place. And so let's continue listening to Dr. Livesey here.
The personal attacks were base, gratuitous.
Personal attacks. Well, I mean, if we're talking about someone who is going against primarily the general position of New Testament scholarship, and again, saying that the attacks were based, I mean, if we look at the Jesus Seminar and we look at their double standards in deciding what Jesus said or didn't say, and this goes, of course, back to the late 1980s and 1990s and so forth, and the double standards of dismissing any scholarship that challenged the position of the Jesus Seminar, that Jesus only said less than 20% of what the Gospels attribute to him. And take the Lord's Prayer, for example. The Jesus Seminar said that Jesus only said "Our Father." And so to resort to saying, well, we're just about they're just personal attacks and so on. Um, let's deal with the content of our argumentation, the basic content of our argumentation on the thesis that Dr. Livesey is propounding, that Paul never existed, which is preposterous. I mean, again, this is almost on the level of the Christ mythicists. Oh, Jesus didn't exist. Um, and yet, other than Jesus of Nazareth, probably the bulk of writing in Christian history and Christian literature has been on the Apostle Paul. So let's listen in again.
Gratuitous and frankly detracted from the effectiveness and the quality of their review of my arguments.
I would not say that. I think that we presented some very good argumentation. Again, when Dr. Livesey says gratuitous and so on, it's deflective. I don't think it's deflective at all. I did my doctorate on the letters of Paul, and here's a here's my book, my first book that I published, which is Worship and the Risen Jesus in the Pauline Letters, which is a publication of my doctorate dissertation. So I think that as a PhD in New Testament and theology with a specialization in Paul and his letters, I think I have some type of bearing, some type of representation in the academy and in New Testament scholarship to speak towards this and to speak about this as well. So to just dismiss it as gratuitous and it's just slapstick humor and so on, the actual argumentation that we presented is based on very well researched scholarship. So let's get back to Dr. Livesey's speech here.
So I urge them to read my book. You've mentioned it, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. In it, I feel they will find reasoned arguments. It was likewise recently published by a highly reputable press and underwent peer review prior to its acceptance. That's to say that my arguments were deemed, at least by some, critical scholars, to be reasonable and credible.
Well, of course, in academia, and I worked for many years as a book review writer for the RBL, for the Review of Biblical Literature. And in my reviews, I read books written by conservative scholars, liberal scholars, and even some extreme scholars who denied Jesus even existed, like Robert Price. To say that it's peer reviewed and therefore doesn't necessarily mean that just because it's peer reviewed that it is true. It simply means that you've made some cases, you've made some arguments that are worthy of review and consideration in the academy. But just because a book is peer reviewed does not mean, it doesn't logically follow that it means that it is the truth, the final say in the matter. That is what critical scholarship is about. The peer review is scholars who look at the arguments. They may not necessarily agree with it, but they're willing to say, this is a good book, or this is a book that brings some new information or may challenge an old idea. But just because it's been peer reviewed, my books have been peer reviewed, it doesn't mean that Dr. Livesey is going to agree with everything I say in my books. And so once again, just to make an appeal to authority and say, which is a logical fallacy, to appeal to an authority that, well, my book's peer reviewed by other scholars. That's great. So have my books been peer reviewed by other scholars. It doesn't logically follow that, therefore, they're necessarily true. They're only true if they correspond to the facts and they correspond to the evidence that we have at our disposal.
So it's likewise, I should say, an academic book with other biblical scholars envisioned as its primary audience. It was not meant either to diminish or to support, for that matter, Christian faith. The book analyzes the history of the arguments surrounding the authentication of Pauline letters.
Well, let me just try to bring this back up again, folks. Just give me a minute here. Sorry, just wanted to get rid of the top. Okay, let me do this again. All right, sorry about that. Let's bring this up again. Just being a little wonky here, I suppose. Okay. There we go, better. So again, she says it's not meant to diminish or to confirm, which of course she's taken clearly a neutral position here. But of course, if the Apostle Paul didn't exist and he didn't write his letters, it does diminish the Christian faith, because Paul is accredited with writing half of the New Testament, at least 13 letters. And if you want to give Hebrews as one of his letters, which the Eastern Church held for which the Eastern Church and even the King James translators placed Paul as the author of Hebrews, which I don't agree with. Most of the Western Church rejects Pauline authorship over Hebrews. But the point is, of course, it has the effect of diminishing if you get rid of the Apostle Paul, which scholars believe is the earliest text we have in the New Testament documents. And so it's one thing to call into question the Pauline epistles, but then to jump from that and say, well, not only are the Pauline epistles not authentic, neither is the writer. Paul is not only is Paul not authentic, but Paul never existed. And once again, I would say that Dr. Livesey is in the minority. And this is not to say that the majority is always right, because that would be another fallacy, argumentum ad populum. But what I would say is the fact that the majority hold to the existence of Paul, that he actually existed, is a strong argument, in that what causes the majority of these scholars to believe Paul existed? It's not a vote. It's not like they took a vote, like the Jesus Seminar, choosing their little marbles, colored marbles, to decide what Jesus said and what Jesus didn't, and they vote on colored marbles, which says something about maybe they were losing their marbles, so to speak. No pun intended. And so the fact that the majority of scholars believe that Jesus of Nazareth existed, even Bart Ehrman wrote a book, Did Jesus Exist? And even the fact that vast majority of scholars believe Paul existed, that is not an argument that therefore the majority wins. It simply means that the evidence has been strong and overwhelming, that it has led majority of scholars, both conservative, liberal, even atheist scholars, to believe that Paul wrote those letters. Bart Ehrman is a self-proclaimed atheist based on the argument of suffering, and he has no doubt Paul existed. So again, there's a reason why the bulk of scholarship holds to this, not because they want it to be true, but because the evidence is overwhelming for it.
And it investigates various other historical aspects within and surrounding the letters. The book also picks up in medias res. That is to say, Pauline scholars have long considered that only 7 Pauline letters are authentic to Paul.
No one's denying that. Again, as a conservative Christian, I don't see any reason to deny the other letters are Pauline. That is to say, I believe that Paul wrote all the 13 letters attributed to his name. The general view among liberal scholars is that Paul wrote only 7 letters that are attributed to him that are authentic. Notice, they're authentic, and if they're authentic Pauline letters, then it logically follows that the author was Paul. That's why they're Pauline letters, and that the writer existed. Now, the 7 letters that scholars, liberal scholars, the majority of them, hold to as being written by Paul, the authentic Pauline letters are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those they hold to be unquestionably written by Paul. The others, like Colossians, Ephesians, and Second Thessalonians, they would take those to be Deutero-Pauline. That is to say, they were written by students of Paul, of the Pauline school. And then the pastoral letters, the later of the letters attributed to Paul, First Timothy, Second Timothy, Titus, they take those to be letters that were actually uh, not written by Paul and not even written by some of his disciples. They would take the position that those letters are basically pseudepigraphic, that not only do we not know who the author is, but they were simply made up, not even by a Pauline school. Now, there are many conservative scholars who hold that those letters are Pauline. Well, first of all, um, the church, for at least the first 1600 years, 1700 years, believed those letters attributed to Paul were written by Paul. So we do have the history of the church backing that up. Um, and there are many scholars today, the late Gordon Fee, among others, believed that all the letters of attributed to Paul are Pauline. In my book, I make reference to that as well. And I'm of that opinion as well. I don't see any reason for denying those letters were written by Paul. When I hear arguments that, well, the pastoral letters, they use the word epiphania, appearance, rather than parousia, the coming of the Lord, so the difference in language determines that this was not written by Paul, and that again, I find it such a vacuous argument because when people get older, and I could say that for a fact that when I look at something I wrote 20 years ago or even 25 years ago, and I look at the way I write now, there's been changes. Your language changes, your grammar changes, the emphasis you may place on something today that you did not emphasize 25 years ago. Why could not Paul change his language? Why could he not uh, mature and in his language and in his writing and use words that he didn't use elsewhere? How is that an argument against Paul authoring Colossians or Ephesians or Second Thessalonians? Um, and what are the reasons why a number of these scholars question the authenticity of these letters? If you look at them, and this has been shown by other scholars, is if you applied those standards to the other letters of Paul, you could argue that Galatians wasn't written by Paul because there's certain words Paul uses there he doesn't use elsewhere. The style is different. Remember, some of Paul's letters were written by scribes. He dictated them, and they were written by scribes. Whereas Galatians, Paul claims he wrote it with his very hands. So I find the arguments to be vacuous. I find the arguments to be they're not very convincing, and there seems to be a pattern in scholarship that you simply go with what the majority say, or you simply go with what you have been taught in your doctoral studies or your graduate studies. So again, everything must be based on evidence. It's a case by case merit system, I believe. And sometimes the majority does count in terms of a long held position, why they held that position. But that doesn't mean that just because the majority holds to it, it must necessarily be true. That would be a fallacy. But once again, we need to look at these claims individually. And in terms of the Pauline authorship of the letters attributed to him, I think that that view has been challenged. It continues to be challenged as to why Paul could not have used different.
Paul. And they've long regarded that the other 7 also attributed to him are pseudonymous.
Pseudonymous in terms of Paul not writing them, but with the exception of the pastoral epistles, that they were written by students of Paul. So, okay, that's fine. But as I've said, this has been a view among scholarship, particularly liberal scholars. So, again, I think Dr. Livesey is simply preaching to the choir here, and she's not saying anything that we have not already known. There's nothing earth-shattering about this statement.
The book has garnered attention because it disturbs a long-held paradigm. For reasons that I discussed elsewhere, I gradually came to doubt the reigning theory that seven Pauline letters, were authored by the Apostle Paul. Since the field unquestionably relies upon this perspective, I found it important to test the theory's ongoing viability. I'm also not the first scholar to doubt the authenticity of Pauline letters. In the late 19th and early 20th century, scholars known as the Dutch radicals argued that none of the Pauline letters were authentic.
Right. And uh, where is that position today? I mean, the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Dutch radical scholars said that Paul didn't write any of it, and yet the majority of scholarship, mostly liberal, believed that he did write the seven letters. At least the seven letters are his authentic letters. Um, what influence did the Dutch radical scholars have on New Testament scholarship in terms of Paul? Not very much. If anything, their position was a fringe view, not just a minority, a fringe view. So while Dr. Livesey rightfully says that there were those in the past who, like the Dutch radical scholars, who questioned whether Paul wrote any of those letters, um, that there's nothing new under the sun, as Ecclesiastes points out. There's nothing new under the sun. What is has already been. So what Dr. Livesey is presenting here is not some. She's not turning. She's not turning some new earth here. This is not like a new thesis or a new revelation. This is something that's already been argued. And notice again the late 19th century, the late 1800s, and the earliest 20th century, the early 1900s. So there's nothing new here under the sun. And so, if anything, Dr. Livesey it appears to me, at least it seems to me, that she's simply regurgitating what some fringe group among the Dutch radical scholars believed. But overwhelmingly, scholarship has rejected that ideology.
That they were all pseudepigrapha. There's comfort in knowing that I'm not the first or the only person to have doubted the authenticity of the letters.
Well, yeah, there's comfort, but at the same time, you know the old saying, "Where's the beef?" Is there anything new here? Is there some new research that's being presented here that's never been presented before? Well, again, the hypercriticism, and this is where I believe that Dr. Livesey is exercising under the notion of hypercriticism. It's so hypercritical that Paul didn't write those letters, but then Paul didn't exist either. Paul, as we know, did not exist. So you have those who say Jesus never existed. Then you have those who say, well, Moses didn't exist. Well, Abraham didn't exist. So 100 years from now, people are going to say Dr. Livesey didn't exist. Tony Costa didn't exist. JFK didn't exist. Martin Luther King didn't exist. I mean, again, this hypercriticism, and why the early church would want to even invent someone like Paul. And it begs the question that no Christian in the first and second century, no one came out and said, there's this guy that we just made up. No, it's assumed that he existed. And to my knowledge, there was nobody in the history of the early church who denied Paul's existence. I mean, even the heretics liked him. I mean, Marcion in 140 AD, Marcion loved Paul to the point that he removed all the other books of the New Testament. He kept 10 of Paul's letters, and he only kept the Gospel of Luke because of Luke's presumed association, because of his association with Paul as a missionary, which he was. And then even with Luke, he excised or removed the first two chapters of Luke because it was too Jewish. So it's one thing to deny the letters of Paul, but then to go forward and say, well, Paul never existed. I mean, even the Jesus Seminar was not willing to go to the point of just saying Jesus didn't exist. They'd say he did, but he's been dressed up by the church into this glorious Son of God and so on.
Dutch radicals likewise reasoned that the letters indicate literary dependency on Acts and the Gospels.
So what Dr. Livesey is telling us is that her work is simply a repeat or a regurgitation of what the Dutch scholar said, which again brings up the point, there's nothing new here. This has all been said before.
According to them, the Paul of the letters evinces an advanced level of theological reflection over that of the Gospels, a view that disturbs their chronological priority.
Why would that be a case? Why would that even? Where's the backup for that? Most scholars do believe Paul's letters were first. There's some close evens with the letter of James. Mark's gospel, even though a number of scholars would place him in the 60s, Mark's gospel contains information in it that goes back even earlier than the 60s, probably into the 50s, and some would even say the 40s. Professor James Robinson, who was a skeptic, John A.T. Robinson. Robinson argued that all the New Testament, all the documents of the New Testament were written between 40 to 60 AD. The view that most of the critics today wouldn't accept, including Dr. Livesey. So what we're hearing here is simply the regurgitation of what has been written before. So really, there's nothing new here.
Regarding the historicity of Paul, which was mentioned in Mike Jones's video, one cannot definitively know without question whether Paul existed.
Well, there's the problem right there. That's the issue. That's the crux of the whole point behind our video that Michael and Erik and myself worked together on. How do we definitively know whether Paul existed or not? Dr. Livesey, how can we definitively know whether Alexander the Great existed or not? Because his biographers wrote much, much, much later. How do we know they didn't make him up? How do we know that Plato actually existed? Since his writings, we don't have many copies of his writings, and by the time we found the manuscript of Plato's Republic and his various writings, they're very late. How do we know Plato existed? How do we know Socrates? Socrates didn't write anything. All we know about Socrates is what Plato tells us that Socrates said. Maybe Plato made him up. Maybe Plato invented Socrates to give force to his own writings. How do we know he existed? How do we know that the Buddha existed? Since the Pali Canon, from which we get the Buddhist scriptures, they don't show up until about 500 years after the presumed death of the Buddha, of Siddhartha Gautama. How do we know that the Buddha existed? How do we know that any classical writer existed? So basically, on Dr. Livesey's perspective, we can just wipe out all classical history. Just get rid of all the classics and throw them out the window because they never existed, based on the similar argumentation that she's presenting here. And so this is what I mean by hypercritical. Dr. Livesey is a hypercritical scholar. And so if you apply her basis of reasoning here, you basically might as well fire all the professors and get rid of all the academic departments on classics in all the universities around the world. Because on her form of argumentation, there was no Thucydides, there was no Plutarch, there was no Plato, no Socrates, no Aristotle, and we can go on and on and on.
So that a lack of non-canonical evidence does not of necessity mean non-existence, and I realize that.
Okay, good. So at least she sees that connection there, but she still posits the idea that Paul didn't exist.
Knowledge of Paul, or better, Paulos, derives from Scripture. As you correctly noted, you, Mike Jones, and your group, and from later Scripture-like works, such as the Acts of Paul. Yet Scripture advances different portraits of Paul. There's one characterization in Acts and a different one in the letters.
How so? How so? Now, I'm not going to bring up Dr. Livesey's book, and honestly, I don't have her book. But I could honestly say that I could see where she's going with this. But how's the portrait different? And why would it not be different? If it is different, it doesn't mean that necessarily Paul.
Which one then?
About that. It doesn't mean necessarily that if the picture of Paul that is being presented to us in the book of Acts is written by Luke, and of course Luke is going to speak of Paul in the third person. And if Paul talks about himself, well, obviously, if Michael Jones is talking about me, he's obviously going to present a picture of me, but it's going to be a third-hand reference. But if I write a letter or write something about myself, of course, that's going to be different. But this is where that hypercriticism keeps creeping in. Why would the picture of Paul be drastically different when what someone says about Dr. Livesey, a friend of hers, a colleague would say about her, and what she says about herself, of course they're going to come out different in one sense, but it's the same person that is being referred to here. So let's continue.
Is the historical Paul. The historical perspective then on scriptures brings with it complications.
Why? Why does it bring, what complications is it bringing here? Again, these are presumed complications, not actual complications.
It's not the simplest or most straightforward path, as you seem to suggest. Rather than try to fit the two different portraits of Paul together to satisfy historical concerns, I've instead adopted a literary lens for the letters and Acts and investigate various literary relationships between them, embracing the differences.
But what are the differences? What are the differences that are being presented here? Again, if we're talking about Luke's writing of the book of Acts, and he talks about Peter and then talks about Paul and other figures, and then Paul speaks of himself, of course they're going to be different. Of course they're going to be different. So again, I'm failing to capture the thrust of Dr. Livesey's argument here. And all I can sense here is that, oh, there's differences. There's a problem here. How so?
Such a perspective allows for assessments of the development of the texts, including their relational dating. My interest is in the circumstances surrounding the development of canonical texts. And the other point that you mentioned is external evidence of Pauline letters. And this I also mention in the book. Scholars have long surmised that there was a collection of Pauline letters dated to 100 CE.
That is something that is hard to accept. 100 CE or 100 AD. How would that be even possible when Paul wrote to the Corinthians? He wrote to them between the years AD 50 to 55. How could Paul's letter to the Corinthians, at least First Corinthians, be placed at 100? Most scholars today would regard Paul's letters, as I said, as the earliest text in the New Testament, placing First Thessalonians probably around 46 AD, and even placing Galatians probably around the same time. And so to place them at 100 AD, I think is quite that is quite suspect altogether.
The earliest witnesses, such as First Clement, the Ignatian letters, the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, and Second Peter, are by convention, then I should say, dated to around that time. They provide evidence of a collection of letters.
Yeah, and the Ignatian letters are placed very early in the second century, at least 110, 120 AD, which would imply that if Ignatius is talking about Paul's letters, it would seem to follow that Ignatius is talking about something that goes back into the first century, not into the early second century. And so if Polycarp and Ignatius, who were believed to be disciples of the Apostle John, who probably died around 96 AD or so, towards the end of the first century, it would seem to logically follow that if they're quoting Paul's letters, that those letters would be part of the first century. And so, and notice how she appeals to convention. Well, by the same standards, the convention is that Paul existed and Paul wrote letters. And most liberal scholars, as already noted, believe that he wrote those 7 authentic letters. So the issue at hand here is that these apostolic writings, these apostolic fathers who wrote these texts, the presumption there is that they are referring to Paul and to his letters. And if you even go to Irenaeus, and Irenaeus talks about the death of both Paul and Peter to have taken place in Rome, there's the understanding that Paul actually existed. And even if you take 2 Peter 3:16-17, which some liberal scholars would say is pseudonymous, they would say that 2 Peter was not written by Peter. Some would say that it was probably written by perhaps a Pauline scholar or a Pauline disciple. 2 Peter 3:16-17 mentions Paul. Not only does it mention Paul, but it mentions Paul's letters as well. And again, I'm of the position that 2 Peter was one of those texts in the church's early history, particularly in the formation of the canon. 2 Peter was one of those texts that was questioned. Was it really written by Peter? And of course, even the great reformer John Calvin commented on this. But I think that the evidence, the internal evidence of 2 Peter, I think clearly points to Peter. And Professor Dr. Michael Kruger who's a specialist in the canon, has written a very convincing article on this question of the Petrine authorship of 2 Peter. And I believe that the evidence points strongly in favor of Peter writing it. But in that second letter of Peter, he clearly alludes to Paul and to his writings, which again would suggest, and even if it was pseudonymous, which is what Dr. Livesey would hold to, even if, let's say, 2 Peter was not written by Peter, at least the writer who wrote it acknowledges that Paul existed and acknowledges his writings as well.
And because they do, they necessitate, you might say, the emergence of those letters to around 100.
Again, very. This is a position that I think is highly dubious. That Paul's letters are written to 100. Well, she has to say that if she wants to argue that Paul never existed, because of it, most scholars would place Paul in the becoming a believer in Jesus around 34 AD, at least a year after the death of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus. But by placing those letters at 100, she could say, well, those are fabricated. They were written by someone that they made up called Paul, and so on, which again, I find highly dubious. If you want to follow the convention, as Dr. Livesey says, the majority of scholars, including liberals, would not place Paul's letters at that late date. They they may want to place the pastoral letters at a very, very late date, but certainly not the letters of Paul that they claim or are believed to be authentic, even including some of the so-called deuteral Pauline letters. So I find this 100 AD date to be very, very dubious, and I think can be clearly and I think effectively challenged by scholars.
However, there's no external evidence, extant living evidence, you might say, of a Pauline collection dated to 100. And in addition to that, in more recent scholarship that I delve into in the book, I find that those witnesses that I just cited, including First Clement, are now dated later. Scholars are doubting
That again, highly, highly dubious. I mean, First Clement, most, I would say, she says most scholars. I would question that. I would challenge that view. Clement was regarded so early that some Christians, the Muratorian canon fragment that mentions the canon of the New Testament, the Muratorian fragment makes reference to not only Paul's letters being part of the canon of the New Testament, but it makes reference to other writings, some of them being the apostolic fathers. And Clement was regarded by many early Christians to be so early that some of them even included First Clement, into the canon of the New Testament in certain areas. And many would place Clement, who is regarded to be the earliest patristic writer outside the New Testament, even earlier than the Didache, the teaching of the apostles, the teaching of the 12. They would place Clement at least around 90 AD. I've even seen some scholars place him at 70 AD and 80 AD. So I think that Dr. Livesey's argument here for Clement's dating here again is highly questionable, and most patristic scholars would place Clement very early, towards the end of the first century, and as I said, no later than 90 AD. And so she wants to put him into the second century. I again would say check out the research on this, and I think Dr. Livesey is really pushing the envelope here in the case of Clement.
that 100 dating for the witnesses. So that relieves, if you will, the pressure to have a collection of Pauline letters dated to 100. And as I've said, there's no evidence for it. In my book, I land on Marcion's collection, which is thought to be dated to the mid-2nd century, as it appears to be the earliest firm evidence of the letters.
Again, Marcion is 140 AD, middle of the 2nd century, Gnostic heretic. But Ignatius is earlier than Marcion. Not only is Ignatius earlier than Marcion, we have Polycarp as well. And so the apostolic witness seems to show us that there is a collection. 2 Peter 3:16 to 17 as well points that out. But the fact that Marcion had to take 10 of Paul's letters, I mean, first of all, the very fact that Marcion took 10 of Paul's letters indicates that Marcion did not hold to this view of the 7 authentic letters, that Paul only wrote 7 letters. He took 10 of those letters to be authentic. The ones he rejected were the pastorals, first and 2nd Timothy and Titus. He rejected those as non-Pauline, and that's because there's references in there to Jewish genealogies and so on. So the very fact that Marcion has a collection of 10 letters, including the Gospel of Luke, is very telling, because that shows us that there were more than 7 letters of Paul. regarded as authentic. Remember, this idea that Paul's letters were regarded as authentic, and there's only 7 of them, this is a much, much later development. This was not the view of the early church. And so the very fact that Marcion regards these as authentic, and these 10 letters, with the exception of the pastorals, I think shows us that no one held to the view that modern liberal scholarship holds to. But notice it's interesting that Dr. Livesey, much like the Jesus Seminar Group, tried to place the Gospel of Thomas, a Gnostic gospel. They tried to place it in the 50s. Even some of them would even try to put it before the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what is interesting is that Dr. Livesey is trying to do something similar, but not by placing Paul's letters early into the 1st century. At least scholars put him in the early mid 1st century, 40, 50 AD, and so forth. But now she's trying to take Paul's letters and she's trying to move them away from the 1st century. So the Jesus Seminar tries to put a Gnostic Gospel of Thomas into the early 1st century, mid 1st century, and then Dr. Livesey is trying to put Paul's letters away from the 1st century into the 2nd century, which I find quite interesting. And considering the fact that the Jesus Seminar opted for a Gnostic gospel, and here Dr. Livesey is opting for a Gnostic adherent by the name of Marcion. So again, I think that the argumentation that Dr. Livesey is putting here on the dating of the letters, again, is a view that if she wants to appeal to convention, that is not the view of conventional scholarship, that these letters are late and that they come in the year 100, the very beginning of the 2nd century. To my knowledge, if that is a view that is held by anyone, it's much like the Dutch radical scholars, a very fringe view.
And as I said in the beginning, the link to purchase the letters of Paul in a Roman literary context, reassessing apostolic authorship, will be in the description below and the pinned comment if you want to get yourself a copy. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Nina.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for allowing me to do this.
Hello, viewers.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope you could see where Dr. Livesey is going with this. Personally speaking, as someone who has read and did my doctoral work in Paul's letters, I find Dr. Livesey's arguments very shallow, and with all due respect to Dr. Livesey, and I do want to thank Dr. Livesey for taking the time to respond to the video. But I find them very, again, vacuous, and I find her argumentation wanting. There just really is no substantial evidence. There's really no meat or substance to what she's saying. It just seems to be ad hoc. It seems to be arbitrary on her part. She appeals to convention, but then goes against convention, and that's fine. That's fine. Scholars are supposed to base their argumentation on evidence, and so I just find the presumed evidence that Dr. Livesey is proposing here, I just find it to be just baseless. And again, with all due respect, it's baseless, and it simply doesn't explain the fact that the early church took Paul's letters as scripture, as we see in 2 Peter 3:16-17. The very fact that we have the apostle Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles writing about half the New Testament, when you would think you would have letters of Philip or the Gospel of Philip, which we do, but again, they're Gnostic. The very fact that the New Testament, 2 of its gospel writers are not even apostles, Mark and Luke, are not apostles. They're disciples of the apostles. So Mark being the disciple of Peter, Luke being the disciple of Paul. The very fact, you would think that the early church, to prop up its credibility, you would think they would have 4 gospels written by 4 bona fide apostles, that is, members of the 12. So we have Matthew as an apostle, John's an apostle, but you would think, well, why didn't Andrew write a gospel? Why didn't Philip write a gospel in the 1st century, or Thomas, or why didn't Simon the Zealot write a gospel? Why didn't Bartholomew or Nathaniel write a gospel? And we can go on and on and on. But the fact that two of the gospel writers are not even apostles, this shows there's a ring of truth to this, that the human inclination would be to have four bona fide apostles among the 12, but that's not what we find. And you would think that from the 12 apostles, I mean, why would we have 13 letters ascribed to an apostle who is not one of the 12, but was called later by the risen Christ, and yet his writings form almost half of the New Testament canon, unless that's how it happened. That is to say, there's a criterion of embarrassment that some people would say it was quite embarrassing that none of the other 12 apostles of the 12 wrote any letters. Like, why didn't Peter write a letter? And we have two of Peter's letters in the New Testament, but why didn't Simon write a letter? And why didn't Andrew write a letter, or Thomas, and so on and so forth? You don't find that. And so it behooves us to consider this and think, well, why would they opt for Paul then? Well, he was the apostle to the Gentiles. Number two, he was known by Peter, John, and James. The apostles knew of him. And so the fact that the church was comfortable accepting Paul's letters as scripture speaks against this theory that, well, Paul must have been invented, or Paul didn't really exist. On the contrary. So we have letters of John. We have 3 letters attributed to John in the New Testament. There's a letter attributed to James, who was the Lord's brother, not one of the apostles, but the Lord's brother. And not the apostle James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, but James, who was called James the Just in church history. We have, again, 2 letters attributed to Peter. There's 1 letter attributed to Jude, or Judas, who was, again, one of the brothers of the Lord. The fact that the New Testament has these letters, some of them written by people who are not actual apostles, like James and Jude, speaks again of that, what I call the ring of truth. It's a criteria of authenticity that we find in the New Testament documents. So I thought that I would give this response to Dr. Livesey, and hopefully you found this interesting. And again, it just goes to show, as we read in the book of Ecclesiastes, that there really is nothing new under the sun. What is has already been. And so Dr. Livesey has openly admitted that she's not the first to say this, which of course begs the question, then why say anything at all? If it's already been said, then why say it again? And so I hope that this has given you some food for thought. I hope it also reinforces the fact that we as Christians, as conservative Christians, that as Orthodox conservative Christians, that we can give an answer. We can give a reasoned response to the critics. And so thank you again for watching, everyone. And once again, I hope that you could like the video, trust it, and share the video. And if you haven't done so already, to subscribe to the channel. Also want to do a shout out on my book, No King But Christ, The Collapse and Bankruptcy of Secular Worldviews. This book deals with the state of the church today and how we as Christians can navigate through the contemporary society in which we live in, where we're challenged with various ideas and worldviews that call into question the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, once again, I trust that you enjoyed the video, and we will see you again in a follow-up live stream. Take care, everyone, and God bless. Bye for now.